All right, so we're going to start our analysis, right, as I said, by looking at the simplest possible economy, which is going to be an economy where we have just two people, we have just two goods, and we have no production, right? The goods just exist. All we need to figure out is how to divvy up the goods between these two individuals. Does this make sense? So to set the stage, let's imagine that, now that we're able to socialize in person again, you're able to spend time with your friends after the pandemic, you realize that you actually hate everyone, so you get in your car, fill up your trunk with beefaroni and water, and drive out to the New Mexico desert, right, to be alone from everyone. And when you get there, you discover this grizzled old survivalist named Wilma, who's been in the desert for decades and decades. Let's imagine that you're out in the desert with 50 gallons of Gatorade. So I'll say the Gatorade for you is 50. And with beefaroni, you've got 700 cans of beefaroni. Wilma's been in the desert for a long, long time. She's learned how to build her own cistern of water, so she just had big packs of dry Gatorade. So she's swimming in Gatorade, but she's running kind of low on beefaroni. So Wilma's Gatorade is 450, right? She's got lots and lots of Gatorade, whereas Wilma's beefaroni is only 300. We're going to try to figure out all the ways that you and Wilma could interact and exchange. What's going to be the consequence of all of those decisions? I want to start by thinking about what all of the possible things that you could end up with in this economy are, right, given what exists. And what I'm going to say is very, very simple, right? We're going to say that we think about everything that you could have. The most you could possibly have, we've got Gatorade, we've got beefaroni, is 1,000 cans of beefaroni and 500 gallons of Gatorade. The reason that's the most you could possibly have is because this is everything that exists in our little world, right? This would mean that the absolute maximum would be that you get all of the beefaroni, you get all of the Gatorade, right? The absolute least you could end up with is nothing, right? Zero of everything. This makes sense? Great. And of course, where you start with 700 cans of beefaroni and 50 gallons of Gatorade, right? So you start right here. Make sense? Great. So how about Wilma? Let's think about what Wilma could possibly get. Well, if we knew how much you got, we would know then how much Wilma gets, right? Because Wilma's just going to end up with everything that you don't get. So if you had, for example, 300 gallons of Gatorade and 200 cans of beefaroni, we would know that Wilma would end up with 200 gallons of Gatorade, right, and 800 cans of beefaroni. This makes sense? In other words, what we can do is if we wanted to think about Wilma's Gatorade, it's just whatever is left over when you've run out of Gatorade. So if we drew kind of a second set of axes right here, right, we could say that when you have everything, when you had 1,000 cans of beefaroni and 500 gallons of Gatorade, there's going to be nothing left over. So Wilma would get nothing. This makes sense? If you had 300 gallons of Gatorade and 200 cans of beefaroni, if you were here, she would have 200 gallons of Gatorade and 800 cans of beefaroni. This makes sense? Because you started out with 700 of the 1,000 cans of beefaroni. She has 300 of them. Because you have 50 gallons of Gatorade, she has 450. Okay, this makes sense? Essentially what we've just done is we've created a little box that contains within it all of the possibilities of our little universe, right? Every possible allocation of goods between you and Wilma is represented by some specific point on the box. Any point on this box gives all of our stuff to somebody, either you get it or Wilma gets it. We're going to call this thing an Edgeworth Box. We'll call it an Edgeworth Box because A, it's a box, and B, it was developed as an idea by this philosopher economist named Francis Isidro Edgeworth, right? So we've named the box after him. One point here that's important, right, that I've kind of made big. We have our initial endowment. We call this our endowment because this is what you and Wilma enter the problem with, right? You walk in with a certain amount of Gatorade and beefaroni. She walks in with a certain amount of Gatorade and beefaroni, right? This is how well you're endowed. Okay, great. So now that we have this box, right, now that we've described all of the possibilities, all of the things that might happen, we can think a little bit about what ought to happen, right? We can think about what outcomes here are better, what outcomes here are worse, right, at least among certain criteria. The place that I might want to start with is, what are all the possibilities that are better for you than just being stuck with what you had initially, right? In other words, when are you going to be happy that some exchange has taken place between you and Wilma, and when are you going to be sad about it? So how are we able to do that, right? How should we illustrate the possibilities that you would prefer to your initial endowment? Well, we have this really useful concept for this, right? We have this really useful graphical tool, which is an indifference curve. So if I drew a curve like this, that goes through your endowment, right? This is going to be telling you all of the combinations that are as good for you as your endowment. Which of course means that everything up here is better for you than your endowment. Everything down here is worse for you than your endowment, right? So we've now split up all of the possibilities here into things that would make you happy relative to where you start and into things that make you sad. Now we can do the exact same thing for Wilma, right? We can say, well, how about for Wilma? What are the things that are going to be better for Wilma than her endowment, right? 450 gallons of Gatorade and 300 cans of beefaroni. And what are all the things that are worse for Wilma? And we can do this by doing exactly the same thing, right? Drawing one of her indifference curves through the endowment. Now this is going to look just like your indifference curves, but from her perspective, right? So the same way that yours bend towards the middle, right? You have diversity is better, they're downward sloping. Hers are also going to show that diversity is better, they're also going to be downward sloping. So this is going to mean they're going to look something like this. Does this make sense? And then we've got a couple of interesting things here, right? We've got all this area here that's better for Wilma. We've got all this area here that's better for you. And we have this area in the middle that's better for you and better for Wilma. So if you and Wilma are able to work together, right, if you're able to hash out a deal with each other, you should be able to, as long as there's some space in here, come up with some alternative to your initial endowment, right? Trade some amount of beefaroni for some amount of Gatorade and make both of you better off. So we're going to call this area here, in between your two indifference curves, we're going to call that your negotiation space. The reason we call this your negotiation space is because this is the area that if you're engaging in a negotiation, right, you're trying to figure out some alternative to where you're starting, you should end up somewhere in between here, right? Somewhere where both of you are going to be better off. And we can see by the shape of your indifference curves, right, as we've drawn the picture here, what it's going to mean to make both of you better off is going to be that you're going to give up some of your beefaroni and get some Gatorade. She's going to give up some Gatorade and get some of your beefaroni, right? Some sort of exchange like that should make everybody happy. Okay, wonderful. So let's say that I pick some spot in your negotiation space, right? Let's say something like this. Say, okay, you guys negotiate so that let's say that you give up 100 cans of beefaroni and get from Wilma 100 gallons of water, right? Just making up numbers so that you move up to 150. She moves down to 350. Numbers aren't important, right? Just making things up. Let's say that your new indifference curves look like this. Not beautifully drawn, but hopefully you get the idea. So given the way we've drawn these indifference curves, is it possible for you to still become better off by continuing to negotiate, by trading further? I'm going to say yes, because there's still a space that's above your indifference curve and also above Wilma's indifference curve. Right? So you're only going to reach a point where you can no longer become better off by trading, right? Where you're done trying to make each other better off, looking for mutually beneficial exchanges, if you reach a point where your indifference curve and her indifference curve just barely kiss, right? Exactly the same way that we had our budget constraint just barely kiss our indifference curves. So to draw that like this, right, we could have your indifference curve and her indifference curve just barely kiss right here, right? And once we're at this point here, we've exhausted all of the possibilities of mutually beneficial exchange, right? We've now taken advantage of all the opportunities to make both you and Wilma better off. What I mean by this is everything that's better for you, then this spot right here, right? Everything up here is worse for Wilma. Everything that's better for Wilma is going to be worse for you. This makes sense? This type of allocation, right, where we've taken advantage of all the opportunities to make everyone better off, Pareto Optimal. We'll call Pareto Optimality what we mean by this. Is that it's impossible to make one person better off without making the other person worse off. This makes sense? Great. I want to talk for a little bit about what it means for an allocation to be Pareto optimal. Because we might be tempted to say what this means is that this is the best possible outcome, right? This is where we ought to end up. And in some respect, that's true. What we can say about this is that if we're not at a Pareto optimal outcome, there's clearly something that's better if we care at all about either of the two people, right? Or if we care at all about both of the two people. So if we start out at our endowment and we say, is this better or worse than this? Clearly, our new traded position is better for everyone, right? Because you're happier and Wilma's happier. This is altogether a good deal. But it's a little bit difficult to say that this particular spot right here is our best possible choice, because there's a bunch of other potential outcomes that are just as much Pareto optimal as this. There's nothing unique about this that tells us that it's Pareto optimal. What do I mean by this? Well, here we found some spot in the middle, right, between your indifference curve and her indifference curve, a place where you're both better off. But what if you were just a very, very bad negotiator, right? What if Wilma was able to take advantage of you and gain all the potential gains from trade? We could have something like this, where you're no happier or sadder than you were originally, but Wilma's happier. And this is also going to be Pareto optimal. It's Pareto optimal for the same exact reason that this one is, right? Because there's no possibility of making you better off without making Wilma worse off, and vice versa. So this is also Pareto optimal. And of course, on the other side, maybe you're a really good negotiator, and Wilma's not a very good negotiator, right? We've got some possibility here where you're much better off than you started. Wilma's no better or worse off than she started. That's also Pareto optimal. This makes sense? And it's Pareto optimal again for exactly the same reason. The reason that there's a bunch of different Pareto optimal outcomes here is because of the fact that we can draw an indifference curve for both of you through every point. Right? So all we're doing is we're saying once we've settled on how happy you ought to be, we're going to find some choice where Wilma's as happy as she can be given how happy you ought to be. And we can do that for any level of happiness. Matter, right? Even these are not all of the Pareto optimal possibilities. There's another couple Pareto optimal possibilities. Like, let's say that when you arrive in the desert, right, with your truck full of Gatorade and beefaroni, let's say that Wilma decides to pull out a sawed-off shotgun and demand that you give her all your stuff, right, and leaves you naked in the desert to die. Well, then you would end up here with absolutely nothing. Wilma would end up with absolutely everything. She would have an indifference curve like this, right? She'd be pleased as punch. You have an indifference curve like this, right? This is the worst case scenario for you. And this is going to be Pareto optimal, right? There's no way to make Wilma happier without making you less happy because she has everything. There's also no way to make you happier without making Wilma less happy because, right, Wilma is as pleased as punch. right? She's as happy as she could possibly be given the circumstances. Right, and of course, same thing over here. If you were able to dispossess Wilma of everything she owned, you would be as happy as you could possibly be, and she would be as unhappy as she could possibly be. So what we're saying is, we can essentially trace a set of Pareto optimal outcomes through this entire curve. I'm sorry, through this entire Edgeworth box, right? Where each point here represents some place where your indifference curve and her indifference curve just barely touch. This makes sense? We'll call this thing the contract curve. We'll call this a contract curve because this is going to represent essentially all of the points where if you guys are good negotiators, right, who take advantage of mutually beneficial exchanges, this is all of the possibilities that you might end up with, right, regardless of whether you're helping each other, whether you're threatening each other, etc. Right? If you're not on the contract curve, there's some opportunity to make both be better off. It's going to be a set of all Pareto optimal outcomes. Cool. And then the last thing here that I want to talk about is a special area of the contract curve, which is right here. I'll call this the core. And this is going to be the part of the contract curve that lies in between your indifference curve through your endowment, which has kind of gotten lost in all of these many indifference curves, right? But it's this one right here. And her indifference curve through her endowment. The reason that we care about the core is that if you guys are trading with each other, right, you're not threatening each other, etc., you're going to have to end up somewhere in the core, right, somewhere on the contract curve where both of you are at least as well off as you started.